Thank you so much for coming. Nomfundo, as I mentioned, is going to moderate the conversation. She's a senior lecturer in the Public Law Department at UCT. Whilst at Oxford, she completed both MPhil and DPhil degrees in law, and she was also a research assistant for the Africa-Oxford Initiative. Without further ado, so you can hear more from the people you're here to listen to, I'll hand over to Nomfundo and she'll give you a further introduction to Max and the session, and we can get right into it. If you have any questions as we go, please do pop them in the Q&A and we can get through as many of them as we can. But over to you, Nomfundo.
Thanks so much, Georgie. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So I have the pleasure to introduce Max Price, South Africa-at-Large Magdalen. I think Max is probably not used to that signifier, but just remember having to do that every time you were in Rhodes House. Max Price is a medical doctor, public health researcher, former Dean of Science at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And he was a vice-chancellor at the University of Cape Town for 10 years, starting in 2008 to 2018. The latter part of those years, around 2015 and 2017, was during what some have called the most transformative years in higher education in South Africa, or if you ask other people, the most disruptive years in higher education in South Africa. At least in the post-apartheid context. This was largely because of two social movements, Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. As most of you here will know, Rhodes Must Fall was a movement that called for the removal of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes at the University of Cape Town. And as is quite clearly articulated in Max's book, it was actually a deeper call for the reckoning with the colonial legacy of UCT and the need for the decolonization or transformation of higher education in South Africa. The second movement, which followed on from Rhodes Must Fall, was the Fees Must Fall movement. And this was a call for free and decolonized education in South Africa. It was sparked by announced increases in university fees in South Africa against the context of a decreasing per capita spend on students by the South African government at the time. In his book, Max documents his personal and political experience of these social movements as a leader of the University of Cape Town, where RMF started, and against the context of his own politics as a former student leader during anti-apartheid protests at the University of the Witwatersrand, and also a person who was committed and is committed to transformation, coming from the University of the Witwatersrand. So without further ado, I'm going to dive right into the question that starts all book launches. Can you tell us why you wrote the book, Max?
Well, that's a shock. Thank you, and thanks, Nomfundo, for agreeing to do this. I really appreciate it, and that you've taken the trouble to delve deeply into the book and think about it. I wrote the book for 3 or 4 reasons. The first was that the period, as you say, particularly 2015 to 2017, was, I believe, the most disruptive period in higher education and the most transformative. I think it was a watershed period. And so it is a period that I think will be studied and researched and reflected upon. And I wanted to document it, to put into the archive at least my version. I recognize that I'm not impartial. Clearly, I'm not an independent historian, but my version of the events and what happened, what I think triggered the protests, why they happened, when they happened, how the university responded, how it impacted on the dynamics internally and externally on the university, and how it affected other universities, not just in South Africa, but around the world. The movement to remove statues, to rename buildings, and a lot of the debate around decolonization the whole debate didn't start, of course, at UCT, but the events at UCT really became a tipping point, I think, for these debates and struggles all over the world. And so it's an important period of history that I wanted to help document. So that was the first motivation. The second was that while I was Vice-Chancellor, we had to make many decisions which pleased no one. Well, they pleased some people, but there were always critics on all sides of the decisions. And when you're in managing a crisis, you often don't have the time to explain decisions, and sometimes it's not appropriate, sometimes it's not strategic to explain why one's making a decision at that time. But I felt that I wanted to explain the thinking. And it's, of course, not just me, because it's an executive team that makes almost all these decisions. And so I wanted to explain the thinking behind many of the decisions we made, especially the controversial ones. And then thirdly, it felt to me like through the process, I had acquired a whole lot of insights into institutional culture and why Black students and staff in particular felt alienated by the UCT culture, and by extrapolation, the culture at the historically white and English in particular universities in South Africa. But I realized also on reading more widely that this is also how many Black students feel in universities, Ivy League universities around the world, and that there are similar issues. And these are either blind spots that some of us have, and trying to share the insights that I gained through this process with a broader community, but in particular a white middle-class community, because I don't have to tell Black readers about this experience. Of course, it's one I need to try to bring white readers along with me. And then finally, the other set of insights or other set of experiences that I thought was worth sharing was experiences around leadership and decision-making, managing crisis, working with the team. There were also, I suppose, fifthly now I'm going into, there were also a number of enduring issues for universities and for corporations, which I thought were worth exploring. For example, there was a lot of contestation about artworks, and that led to debates about who has the right to decide what art is on display. What is the right of an artist themselves to artistic freedom? And that was an issue we grappled with a lot, and I thought that it was the theme that stood alone and was a debate worth elucidating. Similarly, issues around academic freedom and cancelling or uninviting speakers or creating platforms and no platforming. There's the big issue of statues and removing them, which, as I say, is a common theme in many universities now. So several of those themes, which are enduring themes in academia in particular, have chapters devoted to them, and because they came out of the protests at that time.
Okay, yeah. I want us to come back to you come in as a Wits man, which you talk about in the book, an unlikely character for many reasons that you mentioned. And you find what you describe as a university that's complacent. Complacent because of its own identity as having been on the right side of history. Complacency because of a sense of a commitment to non-racialism, a commitment to an ideal of a nation that hadn't actually come to be. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that was, I think, central to the formation of Rhodes Must Fall at UCT at the time, like this identity of the institution and how that had an impact on Black life in academia, as well as in the culture of the institution itself?
Yes. So as you say, I came from Wits, and I had experienced a very similar similar attitude and complacency at Wits before coming to UCT, and particularly in the health science faculty, which I was the dean of. And as you say, it was because the university and the faculty had a sense that it was on the right side of history. And what shook me when I was at Wits was a process we conducted. We called it an internal reconciliation commission, where we invited past students and staff to tell us about their experiences. And that was eye-opening, because most white academics, and it was majority white in 1995, 96, most of them thought that the university had done so well by Black students and Black staff during the 60s, 70s, and 80s that it had been an oasis of freedom, a place where they could study side by side with whites in a almost non-racial environment. And so to hear that Black students and now alumni hadn't experienced it that way at all and felt very bitter about it was eye-opening. When I came to UCT, I found that the university establishment was where Wits had been those 10 years before. They didn't accept or didn't recognize that there was a problem and that Black alumni and current Black students and staff felt that way. And so one of the factors was that why there was that complacency was not just because of the history of resistance to apartheid, but because as South Africa opened up after 1994, the university was doing incredibly well in rankings, in research, in attracting top academics, and had been welcomed into the international community of academics. And it sort of confirmed the attitude at the university, which was sometimes expressed as we are the Harvard of the South or the Oxford of the South, the Ivy League University of the South, because UCT has been ranked as probably one of the top universities in Africa and in most of the Southern Hemisphere. So the attitude was, if it's fixed, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so there was actually a resistance to other changes. But the way I realized that was experienced by Black students and staff, and this is really blew up with the Rhodes Must Fall movement, was that it was experienced as a judgment about superiority and what it requires for you to make it in a place like UCT. And it ranges from things like the accent that you speak with, your worldly exposure and experience, your taste in music and art, and your attitude to the history and traditions of an institution. And UCT was very proud of the extent to which it looks like an Oxbridge College. It does look like an Oxbridge College. The main residences have the cloisters and they're covered in ivy, and many of the aspirations. In fact, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but the aspiration or UCT boasts about having more Rhodes scholars than any other university. And it's almost as if that's our mission, that's our goal, that's the measure of our success. So these are all ways in which colonial attitudes are reproduced in the institution, and which, if you don't speak with the same accent, or if you come from somewhere with a different educational background, because of the efforts at affirmative action in admissions, there were now many students coming into the university who had not had that sort of background, who'd never traveled overseas, who did not have books or libraries at home, for whom this was really an alienating experience. And it felt to them, and the many manifestations of it, I described some of them in the book. Some of them are the unintended consequences of very good initiatives. To take one, we recognized that we needed to offer bridging years and bridging courses to students whose schooling had not equipped them adequately for going into, say, a first-year science course. But the consequence of the affirmative action program was that those bridging years were exclusively Black students. And Black students started seeing this, or it looked to them like they were second-class students. And other students started seeing Black students as having been admitted, but not really being able to cope. That's why they needed these extra courses. And so the feel of the institutional culture was that Black students were being tolerated, they were there, but not really up to scratch.
Yeah.
And
so really, what had been a transformation agenda of trying to include led to some sort of pressures of assimilation for staff and for students. And as you talk about in the book, while the demographics of the student population was changing, the ranks in the senior academic leadership was much slower in its sort of transformation, and arguably still is. So you find this institution in this way. And what I love about the book is you really talk about how the protest about the statue and the call to remove it was a symbolic one. And the real struggle being to force UCT and other institutions, as we've seen how this movement sparked other sort of protests around the world, to grapple with its colonial legacy and calling for it to change and, decolonize with a capital letter D. And I think I want you maybe to share your position on what you think the relationship between the symbols of the statues and the call to transform and decolonize, and why the statues were so integral in relation to the larger call to change and to decolonize the higher education institution.
So the statue and the removal of the statue was important in itself. And I'll come to the sense in which it was symbolic of a larger set of issues. But I do think it was also important in itself. And that was primarily because of how it was located on the campus and and the message it communicated to visitors and members of the campus community. It was located right in the center of the campus, of a sort of almost an amphitheater of buildings. And it's the only large iconic statue there. It was the only statue there. It was the sort of statue that would be put up to the founder of a university, someone who represents the values of the university, someone who one hopes to honor, but also to say, we put the statue here because it reflects well on us. It tells you something about the kind of university we are. And it's that was particularly inappropriate given what Rhodes did stand for and what he had done. But I don't think that there's no place for statues of Rhodes and other people, rogues or others, in a country. And there are other statues of Cecil John Rhodes in South Africa, and there's one behind the Parliament. And I don't think that one needs to be removed because its context and its citing is not such that one draws any conclusions about the institutions or the Parliament or anything else by virtue of Rhodes' statue being there. I would have liked it to have been moved to a gallery or a space where it could be contextualized with history, with text, so that and that people could choose to see it or not see it if they wanted. In the end, the Senate voted differently. So I had proposed that to the Senate, that when that was up for debate, the Senate voted to have it removed altogether from the campus, and it's currently in a storeroom somewhere. And one day, perhaps it will make its way into some sort of gallery. So the statue was important in its own right, but then it was never just about the statue. And taking down the statue didn't mean that was the end of the movement. The statue embodied so much that was important in the culture. So for one thing, of course, Rhodes represented colonization. He was the ultimate imperialist. He wanted to make us all British. He created in part the Rhodes Scholarship and other educational ventures in order to teach those in the colonies of the virtues of the metropole of Britain and Oxford and of that sort of education. So a kind of rebellion against that is also a challenge to this view of metropole and colony with respect to education and with respect to power and with respect to who should rule the world and guide the world. It was also, so even in the direct sense of decolonizing education, it was symbolic. So obviously symbolic of a shift away from who we think are our heroes, and looking a shift to identifying Indigenous heroes, Indigenous leaders and role models, because and so many of the buildings now have names which come from Indigenous languages or which honor leaders and scholars who are Indigenous to South Africa. And then the statue, which was about an individual, also links quite closely to broader sets of values like artworks. Even the architect, so one of the students once said to me, I look at the architecture of this place and I feel I'm out of place. Now, I don't think that means we should change the architecture and that it's that it's wrong somehow. It's not really a value judgment. It's about the architecture. It's a judgment about how the architecture communicates a culture and how we need to recognize that culture is familiar to some of us and very unfamiliar and alien and even hostile to some. And so if we want to make the campus more inclusive, we've got to take account of that and think about what that means, both in building new buildings and the architecture of those buildings, in curating artworks, and not reinforcing that alienating institutional culture.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about, before we talk about the specific social movements and what happened, what is your view of transformation? You come into an institution like UCT in the context of it being the most unequal country in the world. We are consistently ranked as that. The demographics of our students are changing. The academic sort of staffing is not changing as fast. What is the work that happens to transform that institution that you found and that you sort of expanded in your own role as VC prior to the RMF protest and following?
Okay, so I think that transformation at UCT had, firstly, the dimension of changing the demography of the student body. Initially, that was primarily around race, because I think diversity is important in its own sake, for its own sake. It's also important to create role models. It's important to feed the future pipeline of academics. There's all sorts of reasons why, if we're not going to reproduce that inequality, we have to consciously do something to change it. So first, it was the racial diversity and demography of the student body. Interestingly, during the period that I was there, because this wasn't something that started with me, it started even before 1994, actually. But it shifted a little bit significantly to having a greater focus on socioeconomic status and class as the basis of affirmative action, because by the mid 2000s, say 2005, 2010, the first part of my term, we already had many Black students coming in who were coming in from private schools and from very good schools, and actually were getting in entirely on their own recognizances. They didn't need a step up of any sort, a hand up. But interestingly, the university was becoming more and more middle class as a result, because previously the Black students we were recruiting through affirmative action intentions were all coming from poor schools, almost all coming from poor schools. As that shifted, and the class profile of the class of the intake changed, and so we needed to shift, and we did change the criteria, adapt the criteria. Quite often opposed by Black students, but at any rate, that was one of the struggles. So let me not go down that rabbit hole yet. The second was is staff transformation. I've always thought that would take longer, and I personally think that we have to be patient, that it wouldn't transform as quickly as the student body. And it's for some obvious logistic reasons. It takes time to, as you open up the universities at the undergraduate level significantly, to get more and more Black students coming through, going into postgraduate studies, going into doctoral studies, starting on an academic career, and eventually reaching the levels of the professoriate. If one looks at the demography, there are many more lecturers and junior lecturers who are Black, and at any moment in any year, the proportion recruited that are Black in my time were well over 50%. But it takes time for them to progress, and they will. And I don't have any doubt that the demography of the senior leadership and the professoriate will change. But that's the thing, and it needs conscious intervention. It's not just waiting for them to come. So, and there are things we could do. For example, we have an emerging scholars program which allows people who've just had their PhD to take a lighter teaching. Very often, junior staff get a very heavy teaching load, and it actually delays their ability to start researching and publishing. And so we had schemes that would shift the teaching load, that would create, writing support groups, writing retreats, mentorship and tutorship, just ways of trying to accelerate the progress through the ranks, earlier sabbaticals, if that was appropriate, etc. And then there's a final dimension, which is curriculum. And curriculum, I think, has been making good progress pretty consistently. People are hard on the curriculum. I mean, critics, decolonial critics of the establishment, I think, are very hard on the institutions about having been too slow to shift their curricula. I think it's patchy, and that many areas have done great work. I mean, your area is law. I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of lawyers in your presence, but my sense is, nevertheless, that that the law faculty early on introduced customary law, professorships of customary law, African comparative law, and looked at ways of broadening the canon to incorporate. And some would argue they should have made certain courses compulsory rather than voluntary. And so maybe it could have been pushed harder. I think health sciences is another example where the nature of the work is such that you are treating people who constitute the majority of the country. And so you're treating the local diseases. You're not treating exotic diseases. You're treating them with the technologies that exist locally. I think it's an entirely appropriate curriculum. But the way in which decolonization had to expand there was to recognize different belief systems, so that we had to tackle specialists who would say to their students, they would interview a patient at the bedside and say to the patient, let's say a patient was wearing a little string around the wrist. That's often a sign that they've been to a traditional healer, to a sangoma, and that they've been there before coming to the hospital because they hope they can get cured in a traditional healer. And the older style consultant specialist would be very dismissive of that, would label it superstition, would in front of the patient talk to the students about these ignorant patients, and if they'd come earlier instead of going to traditional healer, we could have treated them, now we can't. But no awareness at all of the need to understand different perspectives in color. Now, I think all that's changed, mostly changed. And so I think we're making progress on these curricular decolonization issues.
I want to talk a little bit about a change that I've noticed. As Georgie mentioned, I'm at UCT at the moment, and I think it's something that started during Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. And there is also a texture in the book where you have quite a lot of support and sympathy for the Rhodes Must Fall movement. And I think it's because you found the tactics of the protesters and the legitimacy of that protest quite strong. And then when we get to Fees Must Fall, particularly the second Fees Must Fall movements that happened, there is much less support. And I think that's rooted in your characterization and many others' characterization of those protests as being unlawful and violent. And we could debate that another time. What is lawful, unlawful protest? But there's changes and a lot of difficult decisions are made, including the use of police as well as private security. And one of the things that I think has happened is that it's much easier now for institutions, including UCT, to respond using sort of the state's carceral hand to quieten student protests. Can you talk a little bit about those decisions, how you came to make them, and reflecting back on them, would you have taken a different path, or do you think those were the right decisions at the time?
Yeah, so in 2015, when these protests started, the attitude, I think, on the campus, amongst academics especially, was that we should never bring police onto campus. And that was a legacy or a hangover from 20 or 30 years, 40 years of protests at UCT, when the protests had been anti-apartheid protests, and the police had always been brought on to quell the anti-apartheid process, often very viciously. And so the university had a strong ethic, and the management, the executive of the university, had a strong effort to keep the police off and to handle these protests internally or manage them internally. And at the start of the protest, that was also that was still the dominant view. But what I think changed was the extent to which the protests became violent. This was particularly in 2016. So in 2015, the protests were largely peaceful, which was all of the Rhodes Must Fall protests and the first phase of the Fees Must Fall protests. They were basically peaceful, and to the extent that they were disruptive, and they were disruptive, they were not violent. There was not almost no vandalism. Their lectures were not disrupted in that sense. But in 2016, the protest movement became violent. Now, I think it happened. There's less coherence. The Fallist movement fragmented. There were different agendas. Some of those agendas were still genuine around issues of accommodation or cost of university and not being able to afford university, or other groups that came under the umbrella of the Fallists, like people with disabilities or with mental health issues or gender issues, gender identity issues. But there was also a quite significant core that was really revolutionary and took a view that I call it a Fanonist view, although I think it's a misreading of Frantz Fanon, but they often quoted him. And that view is that if you're really going to decolonize a colonized society, you have to do it through violence. You have to destroy the institutions that are there, and you have to violently overthrow it. And that group believed that 20 years after 1994, there had been not enough change. There had been especially not enough socioeconomic change, huge inequalities. And in their view, they looked at the institution and they saw this culture which hadn't changed as well, or hadn't changed enough, not enough black academics or professors. And their theory after Fanon was that you needed to destroy the university. And this was represented in everything from a bonfire of artworks, a bomb thrown into my office during a period of protest, some arson attacks against buses and research vehicles, blockading the campus so that people couldn't come and write exams or couldn't come into class. And basically, the university had to, protect the rights of other students, protect staff, protect the property, and there's very one's options to do that are really quite limited. I went out of my way to negotiate with protesters, almost any protesters. I didn't sort of dismiss any of them as too radical or too violent. I thought, because I really feel that one needs to go as far as you can to find the common ground and to negotiate. And I have been severely criticized. Many more of my critics come from the side that say, I should have brought the police on earlier. I should have brought private security on. I negotiated with people who were not sincere or were not being rational, or whose agenda was actually not to find a solution. But I think you do have to do that first, because my experience has been when you bring police on and when you bring security, that often escalates the violence. So you bring it on in the hope that you can control violent behavior, but very often, and it's partly, at least I'm talking about the South African police and the South African private security, who are not very good at crowd control and riot control, and they and so my experience was that often resulted in larger conflagrations. They would disperse the crowd, and then the crowd would go all over the campus and set little fires alight in other places, or break windows in other places. So it usually wasn't a good solution, but sometimes it's necessary if you've got nothing else. And I think that through exposure to many of those protests over those 2 or 3 years, the attitude amongst academics and amongst the Senate and Council shifted. And we then developed a policy that would guide the executive about when to bring in security, when to bring in police, which includes, the fact that, for example, as Vice Chancellor, I would have to consult the Chair of Council. I would have to consult the SRC President if the SRC President was willing to say, this is what we're going to have to do. So I think there's some checks and balances. But in my view, the change in attitudes is the result of the change in the nature of in the methods of the protest.
Yeah, I mean, I'll move on from this. I would love to see these policies, because with the incident last year, nobody took accountability for who actually called the police. So we still don't know who called the police last year when they used tear gas against students in the law faculty. So it's now normalization of the use of the state and its power and its force, and with those checks and balances seemingly nowhere. But yeah. So
and policy might have changed, but under me, in my time, only the Vice Chancellor could call the police.
Yeah. So I want to come back to something you've alluded to several times now, and we're running out of time because it's the two of us. We're living in a time when a lot of people are talking about the shrinking space for academic freedom. I think right now in university campuses all over the world, people seeing, academics who are critical of the state of Israel and the current genocide happening in Palestine, and a shrinking of space for those academics of protest, student protests on campuses. I think today I saw in Colombia, if I'm not incorrect, student protests, use of force and against those students. During Fees Must Fall and Rhodes Must Fall, there were several incidents where the question about academic freedom and art and expression was at the core. Can you reflect a little bit, maybe through the example of the Fleming Rose incident, where you made the difficult decision to disinvite Fleming Rose? For those who don't know, Fleming Rose is a Danish journalist who had commissioned several, I think, cartoons, one of which depicted the Prophet Muhammad, whose turban was depicted as a bomb. And so there was the statue of Sarah Baartman, which was covered as an act of protest. There was the burning of art. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of RMF and Fees Must Fall on academic freedom, and what you think the future of academic freedom is in light of more recent events across the globe?
Thanks. Yeah. I say in the book that the decision to disinvite Fleming Rose was the hardest decision I took throughout my 10 years as Vice Chancellor. And it was the hardest decision because the principle I would like to uphold in the university would be that the university is a space where we can hear all views, including those that offend us. And I would have liked Fleming Rose, as controversial a figure as he is, to be allowed to speak. I decided to disinvite him. He'd been invited by the Academic Freedom Committee to give the Academic Freedom Lecture. And people may be surprised by that, but and I was surprised by that. But anyway, I don't think he should have been invited, but he was, and that's because he has this sort of radical view that nothing should be sacrosanct, from cartoons, from satire, from being lampooned, including religious icons and religious symbols. And so he goes out of his way. He went out of his way to mock them in a way. Now, I don't necessarily agree with his view on that, but I think we should be able to debate that view, and that requires us to be able to hear him and to have other people speak and present different views. I disinvited him because after extensive consultation, I and my executive recognized that there was going to be a huge amount of violence erupting on the campus, that we might have difficulty protecting him personally, that the lecture probably wouldn't actually take place because the only way that you could, that the lecture wouldn't be disrupted would be if you somehow screened the people who are coming in. And that would amount, unfortunately, to an ethnic screening or an ethnic profiling, because how do you decide who's going to be disruptive of a speaker who is criticizing Islam or Islamic positions? So, and that it came in the middle of 2016, which was also this year of extreme violence. The Rhodes Must Fall group, which was predominantly black students, or more black students, but also the theme of Rhodes Must Fall is decolonization in a way. The group that would have been particularly strong in leading the anti-Fleming Rose protest would have been the Palestinian solidarity groups. And that would have produced, and they would have been closely aligned with Rhodes force. So it wouldn't just have been one group of students, it would have been a very wide-scale protest. And so that was the reason. I did say that I hoped he would be able to come at a different time, and the campus was less volatile, and on a different platform, because I didn't think it was appropriate. One of the things about eponymous lectures at universities is that you select lecturers sometimes, usually, who represent the values of the university. It's a bit like the statue in a way. If you're going to choose a graduation speaker or a commencement speaker in the States, you're likely to choose someone who represents the values of the institution. You wouldn't, and I don't think that Fleming Rose represents the values of the institution. So I wouldn't invite him to give the named academic freedom lecture on behalf of the university. But I would like to see him on the campus in a debate or in a forum where the issues he raises can be debated and where it's not assumed that he represents us. So yeah, that was the issue then. And for me, it was a sign that we were unable to protect academic freedom. I regretted that, and I remain of the view that we should protect those spaces, even when people offend us. So turning to for example, debates about, so every year there was there probably still is, but every year while I was there was a week in March called Israel Apartheid Week. And this was a week which often turned, not usually violent, but very tense, because you had the Palestinian Solidarity Front, the Forum, organizing a whole lot of campaigns, lectures, presentations, posters against Zionism and against what the state of Israel was doing, and in favor of Palestinian liberation. And you have other students, and particularly the South African Union of Jewish Students, who wanted to oppose that. And they would often, if you're going to protect the right to protest and to organize and to associate, in a way, you have to give them both the right to do that. And so in the same week, you had this very tense environment. And I was approached every year by particularly the representatives of the Jewish community in South Africa, asking me to ban Israel Apartheid Week, not to let it happen, saying that it made Jewish students feel unsafe, that it made them feel discriminated against. And we refused to ban it. We said that it has to happen. We have to protect the space for that. And I still think that's the case. I also think we have to protect the space for people who are pro-Zionist to express and state their view. And that we need to be careful of behavior that creates a chilling effect on either side on free speech. I think, unfortunately, during the Fordist period, or 16, 17, there was a chilling, the camps became racially quite polarized, and there was a chilling effect. In my view, it was particularly on white students, but perhaps black students, some black students also felt it, in that they were unable, the discussion, they couldn't talk openly because they felt they would be condemned as racist. Anything they said that was critical or took a different position from that of a black person in certain fora, I mean, I am generalizing, but I'm just, in certain fora, would be condemned as saying, you haven't had my experience, you can't feel my pain, you have no right to speak about anything that affects black people or women or gay or disabled people. And so that I think inhibits academic freedom, and we need to guard against it, in my opinion.
Okay. I really just want to talk a little bit more about you and your leadership during this period. So I have two questions relating to this because we're running out of time. There's so much I want to talk about, but how did this experience change you and your leadership? And what are the big lessons from your experience that you would impart on someone who's coming into a position of leadership during a time of crisis? Are there things that really transformed within yourself and in your leadership from your experience at UCT? And where did you draw from as a leader during this time?
I think that I'd like to think that I always had this quality, but it really was, the importance of it was was brought home to me in this period of transformation and challenge. And that was an ability to listen really deeply and openly and try to understand not what the other person was saying and thinking and feeling, and not reflexively to reject it because it was so alien to me. I mean, one example of that was the slaughter of the sheep on the campus. You know, I was at an international meeting of the students. It's a longer story, and we don't have time. Hopefully, people will read about it in the book. But the students, in fact, it was an act of provocation. I knew that, but they decided to slaughter a sheep on the campus and to, you know, skin it and to then fry it, barbecue it. And for most people on the campus, and for the residents in the near vicinity of the campus, and for the staff, and for this was abhorrent. And I remember when going to an international meeting of vice chancellors, was actually at the World Economic Forum. We had an annual meeting of vice chancellors, about 20 of the vice chancellors of the world's leading universities, and we would spend the first few hours just talking about what was happening on our campus, how related this incident. And I could see in the expression of the other vice chancellors, you know, what must be happening to standards at UCT. They've clearly gone to the dogs if the students are slaughtering sheep on the campus. But for me, it was what the experience was about, just trying to understand from the perspective of the students and in fact of the Black community, that this was a quite routine part of some of their culture. It was something they would do every weekend at their homes, say in the townships, and that it was just in a way foreign, different for white people in the Cape Town suburbs, and we needed to stop and not just reject it and condemn it and discipline the students, which is what I was being asked to do, but to say, you know, to examine it more deeply. So the one quality was listening and trying to understand it from the other person's point of view. The second, I think, was having a team, and I was lucky. You don't always get lucky with the team that you build. I was fortunate that I had the opportunity to build a team because quite a lot of senior positions became vacant shortly after I was appointed, and it was a team that was both very loyal. There was no backstabbing. There was no speaking behind people's back, but also a team that was that I think felt comfortable giving me a piece of their mind and telling me what they thought, and that we made much better decisions as a result. And for a leader, you have to create that level of comfort. You have to create an environment, and you have to do that before you get to the crisis, not when you're in the crisis, where people know that you don't judge them negatively if they disagree with you, even if they disagree with you strongly. And you know that when a decision's been taken by the team, everyone will go with it. So you may argue, if you're in the rowing boat in a crisis, in a storm, you may argue about which way the coast is, and everyone must have their say. But once the decision is made, everyone's rowing in the same direction. And I feel that I had the benefit of that sort of team, and that I helped build it up and before the crisis started. So those would be two of the things. And then also, in a way, you can't survive that kind of pressure for long without personal support. So I had the very great benefit of family, wife and 2 kids, all of whom were in some ways involved and really understood what was going on. My wife's a professor at UCT. My kids were students there. And so this was something they could relate to and could provide support, and that was really important as well. And so I think those are 3 things. And then I think I'm lucky to have been born with a thick skin, so that I don't take things personally, and to the extent that people can influence that, can maybe have a sounding board to remind that, who can constantly remind them when you're attacked in the newspapers or at a press conference or something, or in social media especially, not to take it personally, that you're the face of the organization, you're the representative. So naturally, you're going to be the lightning rod for all of the criticism. and very seldom just does the praise come out. It usually is criticism, but you've got a job to do, and you listen to the criticism, because sometimes there's important stuff that you need to hear, but you can't take it personally. So to some extent, I think I've been lucky in having that as a personality trait, and no doubt I miss a lot of nuance and stuff because I do have a thick skin.
Yeah. To everyone in the audience, we are welcoming all questions. I think there's a question from Humaira Musa. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but I think we've covered this. I think this question really is about whether the use of police during the protests entrenched a view of the institutional culture being racially exclusive and resistant to transformation. Do you want to say anything more in relation to that? Oh, I think we did cover it quite a bit.
I think we did, and I think although the book relates 3 or 4 periods of serious protest, and the use of police really became something towards the end. So Rhodes must fall, which was mainly 2015. There were basically no police or private security involved in that. But there's lots of nuances. I mean, one of the problems in South Africa is that the private security tends to be ex-militias from Central Africa who have come down or been recruited. Some of them are mercenaries, and they are dangerous. And so one of the reasons why one might choose not to use private securities is because they can be out of control. And sometimes the police can be much better. There's one branch of the police, the public order police, who I have a lot of respect for. I think that they have really been, some of them, the ones that I dealt with in Cape Town, had really been well trained in mediating and trying to diffuse a tense situation before wading in there. And they were, in my view, very good, actually. So it's not a generic comment about any state cursive apparatus. One needs to really unpack them, differentiate them, and choose the ones that you feel you can work with and the ones you can't.
Or find alternatives. And I want to talk a little bit about one of the things you've been heavily criticized for, or on the other hand, you've been really celebrated for, is the choice that was made following Fees Must Fall to follow a path of restorative justice and reconciliation. And just maybe reflect on why you think that was a path necessary at the time for UCT, and why perhaps you would encourage other leaders to consider alternative forms of rebuilding institutions rather than following the carceral route.
Following the what routes?
The carceral route, so the use of the criminal justice system, and
okay.
It's my Model C accent sometimes.
No, it's your legal job. So the first point I would make to people who are managing universities is to remind yourself constantly that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that controls your social and antisocial behavior, only reaches maturity around the age of 25. And students who are 17 to 23, 24, they're growing, they're learning. And if I reflect on my own youth as a student leader, there are things I did that I'm embarrassed about and I wouldn't do today. There are things I did because I was immature and naive. There are things I did which were rash and I hadn't thought through the consequences fully. And so I think that being at university is about growing up and getting an education, not only in the classroom, but especially for people in leadership positions. It's also about learning to lead, learning to deal with crisis, learning to negotiate. So I don't think people should be punished for life, get a life sentence, such as an expulsion from the university, never be able to complete their degrees. We have senior students who are in their 4th or 5th year of their law degree, 1 or 2 years away from qualifying, perhaps after 5 years. To expel them, it's a very serious thing, and we need to be sure that there's no alternative and that this is really the best thing for their development. And so recognizing that students are developing and growing still is one reason why I think one should deal that punitive and carceral responses may not be the same as if you just as simply in the adult criminal world out there. Secondly, I think, as I said, that we can role model conflict resolution, part of that education. And many of these students grow up in an environment where conflict is always resolved with violence. It's the only tools they know of for conflict resolution. And they bring a lot of that baggage to the campus. We need to use the opportunity to role model different ways of dealing with conflict, through negotiation, through discussion, through compromise, and not just punitively. So the students who were punished, for example, that they were expelled, and then they were offered the opportunity of having that expulsion suspended, if they would agree that they had done wrong, they would respect the university's rules in the future. They respected the authority of the university disciplinary process to make judgments on them, which previously, when they came in, so some of the students came in and said, I refuse to plead, I don't accept the authority of the student disciplinary court. This is all a colonial construct. It's the kind of Mandela position during his treason trial, where he said, this is a white man's court. You should have no jurisdiction over me. So the students tried that as well. And how does an institution respond if students reject the rules and the systems in place? Well, we had to respond by saying, if you don't plead, we have to go on the basis of the prosecution, and we find you guilty, and you can appeal if you want to. If you don't accept the system, you don't appeal, then you'll be expelled. But then we want to offer them an alternative as well. I'm going to say, if you are willing to accept this, if you realize you've made a mistake, if you rethink this, we're not really interested in just punishing you. We're interested in you becoming better leaders. So I think that's very often what drove my concern, my interest in negotiating. And then the other point was that you only have kind of two alternatives. Well, you had three alternatives. One alternative was to close the university. And in some parts of the world, that is often what is done. I mean, I was on the council of the University of Ghana for many years. And the University of Ghana, if there was a significant strike, their strategy was to close the university for a while and then open it later when things had calmed down. But that throughout the academic years and the intakes and the graduation rates, we didn't feel we should do that. And it would have been very expensive. A second option is to bring in, the police and security and just try to lock people up and control it. You can do that sometimes if you've got a relatively small group of people, and also if you think they don't have support. But in these protests, there were large numbers. I would say 2,000, 3,000 students at a time, and they had even a wider support base. So that if you really took out the leadership, this happened at one point, the rest of the students reckoned that they had just been unlucky. They were the martyrs. They'd been unlucky to get caught because other students felt the same way. They just hadn't been caught. And that escalated the scale of the protest. So there's also a strategic question about whether you actually can control it in the most efficient way, coercively. And then the third option is negotiating as far as you can. And as I say, the Fallist movement had become a movement, an umbrella for many different causes around gender, around the trans collective, the disability, the mental health, as well as Black Lives Matter and race issues. And it had this core of Fanonist revolutionaries in the middle of it. And while they were all aggrieved, they were a massive force, a force that we couldn't really do anything about except close the university, which is what we did for a few weeks while we were negotiating. But by negotiating with each of these groups and by addressing the legitimate concerns of the students with disabilities who said that we needed to have hearing loops in the classroom so that the partially, those with hearing aids could hear better, or a sign language interpreter, or wheelchair-friendly classrooms. And the people with the trans students wanted gender-neutral toilets, which we didn't have at the time. And the mental health students students with mental health challenges wanted a significant increase in the amount of mental health services available through the student wellness clinics. These were all legitimate issues, and they were things we could address or could undertake to address. Having done that, those groups split away from the core revolutionary group, and we were then left with actually a very small group which we could address coercively if we needed to, and we did that. So it's also, a lot of it is about strategy in the particular context, and so it's not a general principle or a rule that can always apply in other contexts.
So we run out of time. So I have a parting question for you. I think I know the answer, having read the book. Would you do it again?
And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
I want to be an actor, not a bystander, when history is made in my environment. It sounds a bit hubristic, but what I mean is I was in the right place at the right time, and I had the opportunity, and I could either have been an academic not directly involved, not taking up the reins, or someone who was trying to influence the direction and hopefully having some greater impact than I might otherwise have had. And that's been extremely rewarding, and is why I would do it again.
Yeah. I just wanted to encourage everyone to buy the book. I think if you want to know what happened during these two social movements, but also if you want to sort of get some lessons on crisis leadership, this is a really good book. I think for me, what I got from it is a recommitting to the struggle. You know, I mentioned this to you a day ago that in 2 weeks, campus opens and we are anticipating protests, and I will fight for no police, and hopefully that this year will be a little bit better than last year. And I think reading this book helped me recommit to that. And I know that everybody who reads it will find something to push them towards their cause as well. Thank you so much, Max and Georgie.
Thank you very much. And thanks.
Thank you both. So thank you both so much.